the morning of December 16, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the Secretary of the Navy walked into a quiet office in Washington and offered a 56-year-old Rear Admiral the most important military command in American history. The Rear Admiral said no. He asked the Secretary to give the job to someone else, anyone else. He was the 29th choice on the list. 28 admirals senior to him had already been considered and passed over. Too old, too cautious, too close to the disaster that had just destroyed the fleet. Too politically dangerous to survive the investigation that was already beginning. Chester Nimitz did not want the Pacific Fleet. Franklin Roosevelt did not care. This is the story of why the greatest naval command in American history went to the man who tried hardest to refuse it, and why, against every institutional instinct, that decision changed the course of the war. 9 days earlier, just after 8 o'clock on the morning of December 7, 1941, the USS Arizona had blown apart in Pearl Harbor. One armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch naval shell, modified to penetrate armored deck plating. It punched through the Arizona's forward deck near Turret 2, 11 minutes into the attack, and 1,177 men were gone in a single explosion, the forward magazine igniting in a fireball visible from 20 miles away. The explosion lasted less than 2 seconds. The dying took longer. By 9:15 in the morning, the Pacific Fleet was effectively finished as a fighting force. 5 battleships rested on the bottom of the harbor. Oklahoma capsized to port, West Virginia settled upright in the mud, California slowly sinking through the morning hours, Nevada run aground on Hospital Point to avoid blocking the channel. Arizona was gone. 3 more battleships were damaged and crippled. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, lined up wing to wing as ordered, to prevent sabotage from within, an arrangement that made them perfect targets from above. 2,403 Americans were dead. The attack had lasted 110 minutes. That was all it took to end the most powerful naval force in the Pacific Ocean. In Washington, the shock lasted less than 24 hours. Then the questions started, and the questions never stopped. Who knew? Who should have known? Who gave what orders? Why were the aircraft on the ground? Why was the fleet in harbor? Why was there no warning? Why was there no radar response? Why were the depth charges not loaded? Why? An avalanche of questions from Congress, from the press, from a public that wanted someone to answer for the dead. The Navy needed a scapegoat. It also needed a commander. And those were 2 different problems. Admiral Husband Kimmel, 59 years old, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was stripped of his 4 stars on December 17th, 10 days after the attack. He reverted to Rear Admiral. His career was finished before the investigation had even formally begun. He would spend the next decade, and then the rest of his life, trying to explain what happened on the morning he was shaving when his window lit up white. No one would listen in any way that mattered, but blame was not the urgent problem. The urgent problem was that the United States Navy had just lost its Pacific Fleet. Japan was advancing across the ocean unchecked. Guam had already fallen. Wake Island was under siege. And the most important military command in America had no permanent leader. Vice Admiral William Pye, 61 years old, took over as acting commander of the Pacific Fleet the moment Kimmel was relieved. He had been at Pearl Harbor. He had watched the attack from his flagship, and his first major decision as acting commander would define everything people came to believe about the difference between caution and cowardice in high command. On December 11, 1941, a relief force, built around the carrier Saratoga and supported by cruisers and destroyers, was within 600 miles of Wake Island. Wake had been under attack since December 8th. Fewer than 500 Marines and a handful of Wildcat fighters were holding the atoll against an invasion force. They were sending messages that amounted to requests for ammunition and more planes. They were holding. Pye recalled the relief force. He said the risk was too great, the carrier was too valuable, the tactical picture was too uncertain. Wake Island fell to the Japanese on the 23rd. Under 1,000 Marines, nearly 200 civilian contractors, all of them taken prisoner. The Marines who had held the atoll for 16 days against a full Japanese invasion fleet were now in Japanese hands, and the United States had not attempted a rescue. That was Pye's first and last major decision as acting commander. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox flew to Pearl Harbor in person. He walked the ruins. He stood at the edge of the harbor and looked at the Oklahoma's hull above the waterline, at the Arizona's superstructure listing at an angle that meant the ship would never float again, at the oil slick that still coated the water black more than a week after the attack. Then he flew back to Washington and told Roosevelt what everyone already understood, but no one wanted to say aloud. The seat was a grave. Whoever accepted command of the Pacific Fleet inherited a shattered force, a demoralized officer corps, an enraged public demanding accountability, a Congress demanding investigations, and the near certainty that Japan, which had just demonstrated it could strike anywhere, anytime, would strike again before anything could be rebuilt. Every subsequent mistake would be his mistake. Every subsequent loss would be his loss. The political exposure was total. The margin for error was zero. Knox began working through the Navy's flag officer list. He went through every name senior to the man he would eventually choose. 28 admirals considered and set aside. Too old, too cautious, too close to the disaster, too politically exposed. One flag officer had already been passed over at Pearl Harbor. Another had supervised the Wake Island withdrawal. A third was under investigation. A fourth was simply not the right man for a command that required something no list could measure. Only one man on the entire list had ever been offered this command before. Only one had refused it. 11 months earlier, in January of 1941, Frank Knox had walked into a quiet office in Washington and asked a submarine officer named Chester Nimitz to take command of the United States Pacific Fleet. Nimitz, then 55, was running the Bureau of Navigation, the administrative heart of the Navy's personnel system. He managed assignments, promotions, retirements. He knew the officer corps better than almost anyone alive. And when Knox made the offer, Nimitz shook his head and gave an answer that was either remarkable modesty or remarkable foresight, depending on when you heard it. He was too junior, he said. 28 flag officers were senior to him in the Navy's hierarchy. If he leapfrogged all of them to take the Pacific Fleet, the resentment within the officer corps would be institutional and lasting. It would poison the command before he had even settled into the chair. Give it to someone else, he told Knox. Give it to someone the senior admirals will accept. That someone else was Husband Kimmel. The math of what followed is worth sitting with for a moment. If Nimitz had said yes in January of 1941, he would have been the man in Kimmel's chair on the morning of December 7th. He would have been the man on the dock when the Arizona exploded. He would have been the man in front of the cameras and the newspapers and the congressional investigators. His career would have ended in the same stripping of stars that ended Kimmel's. The Pacific Fleet would have needed a new commander anyway. He said no, and that no saved him and perhaps the war. Now, on December 16th, 1941, Frank Knox walked back into Chester Nimitz's office for the second time in 11 months and asked the same question. And for the second time, Chester Nimitz tried to say no. He asked Knox to give the command to William Pye instead. Knox refused. Nimitz looked at the man across the desk. He understood what the job was. He understood what it would mean. And then he asked for his orders. Chester William Nimitz was 56 years old in December of 1941. He had been born in Fredericksburg, Texas, on the 24th of February, 1885, in a limestone building that his grandfather had built by hand from the hill country rock. His grandfather was a retired German merchant mariner who had settled in the Texas hill country and built a hotel shaped like a steamship, complete with a rooftop bridge. Nimitz grew up surrounded by the language of the sea, German accented, landlocked, 2,000 miles from the nearest ocean. His father died before he was born. His family had no money. He wanted West Point. There was no appointment available for a poor boy from Fredericksburg. So he applied to the Naval Academy instead, because the Naval Academy was free, and because the sea was in the building where he slept. He graduated from Annapolis in 1905, ranked 7th in a class of 114. The graduation was accelerated by a year because the Navy needed officers. Nimitz was 20 years old and a commissioned officer before most of his peers had finished their education. That same year, the young ensign sailed into Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship USS Ohio. Japan had just annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima in the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar. 38 Russian warships sunk or captured. Over 4,000 Russian sailors dead. The man who had delivered that victory, Admiral Haihachiro Togo, was hosting American officers at a reception. Nimitz stood in line. He shook Togo's hand. He never forgot the occasion, and he never forgot the lesson embedded in it, that a smaller fleet, with better doctrine, better training, and better intelligence about enemy intent, could destroy a larger one. He would have occasion to apply that lesson 37 years later, 3 years after Annapolis. As a junior officer commanding the destroyer USS Decatur, he ran the ship aground on a mudflat in the Philippines. He was court-martialed, reprimanded, docked 3 months' pay. Under the logic of the peacetime Navy's advancement system, that reprimand should have been the end of his career. It marked his record permanently. It wasn't. The Navy sent him to submarines because no one else wanted the assignment. In 1909, submarines were dangerous, primitive, and largely experimental. They were powered by gasoline, a fuel that could flood the bilges with explosive vapor and kill an entire crew before the enemy had any opportunity to do so. The casualty rate among early submarine crews was not a matter of enemy action. It was a matter of engineering. Nimitz spent the better part of the next decade rebuilding the American submarine service around a different engine, the diesel. Safer, more powerful, more reliable. He learned diesel engineering from the ground up, reading German manuals, corresponding with European manufacturers, visiting plants on his own time. He commanded the first diesel submarine in the United States Navy. He supervised the conversion of the entire submarine force. He was briefing visitors at a diesel manufacturing plant one afternoon, pointing at the machinery when the rotating flywheel caught his academy ring and took the ring finger with it. A clean amputation at the base. He finished the tour. That, more than any battle, more than any citation, more than any performance review, is the story that explains what Frank Knox was buying when he put Nimitz in the chair at Pearl Harbor. A man who finished the tour. Chester Nimitz left Washington by train on December 19, 1941. He was still, at that moment, a rear admiral. His promotion had not yet been processed. He traveled 6 days across a continent that was adjusting, in real time, to the fact of a two-ocean war. Blackout curtains on train windows, sealed orders in his briefcase, the Pacific getting closer with every hour. He reached the West Coast, transferred to a PBY Coronado flying boat, and landed at Pearl Harbor at 7 o'clock in the morning on December 25, 1941. Christmas Day. He was still wearing a civilian suit. The harbor was a graveyard. Fuel oil coated the surface of the water, an inch thick, still black and shimmering more than 2 weeks after the attack. The upturned hull of the Oklahoma rose above the waterline like the back of a beached whale, its keel in the air, its crew still trapped inside. The Arizona's superstructure jutted out of the water at an angle that made the geometry of the explosion visible. The force that had torn the ship apart, preserved in the position of what remained. The smell was everywhere. Fuel. Steel that had been burned and then cooled. The particular smell that men who were there would never be able to describe adequately to anyone who wasn't. 18 days after the attack, they were still recovering bodies. Nimitz walked the docks in silence. His staff from Washington was with him. The officers who had served under Kimmel were waiting somewhere in the background, expecting the worst. Transfers, investigations, scapegoating, exile to the worst postings the Navy could find. That was what the newspapers wanted. That was what the congressional investigators were being told to demand. That was the standard institutional response to catastrophic failure. Nimitz walked, and then he stopped, and he saw what no one else had thought to catalogue, because everyone else had spent 3 weeks cataloguing what was missing. The Japanese had struck the battleships because the battleships were the most visible targets in the harbour. Lined up in battleship row, hull to hull, exactly where American naval doctrine said they should be. The Japanese had planned their attack for exactly those targets, at exactly that position, with exact intelligence about where those ships would be on a Sunday morning. And in doing so, they had missed almost everything else. The fuel tank farm, 9 million gallons of bunker fuel stored in tanks that sat in the open, unarmoured, above the waterline, had not been touched. If those tanks had burned, the Pacific Fleet's operational capacity would have been set back not weeks but months. Some estimates at the time suggested a year. The repair yards were intact. Dry dock number 1, the machine shops, the cranes, the facilities that had taken decades to build and could not have been replaced quickly were standing exactly as they had been on December 6th. The submarine base, piers, torpedoes, shops, the infrastructure of the one weapons system that would carry the Pacific War for the next 18 months, was completely undamaged. And every aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet had been at sea on December 7th. The Enterprise was returning from delivering marine aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was en route to Midway on a similar mission. The Saratoga was on the west coast. None of them had been in the harbor. None of them had been struck. The battleship Navy was dead. The war Mahan had theorized, the war that Knox and Roosevelt and every admiral of the preceding generation had planned and built and funded. That war was over before it started. But the tools to build a different kind of war were still here. Nimitz understood that in a way that would take Washington months to catch up to. On December 31st, 1941, Chester Nimitz assumed formal command of the United States Pacific Fleet. Under normal circumstances, this ceremony would have taken place on the deck of a battleship, the visible symbol of American naval power, the flagship of the most powerful fleet on Earth. There was no battleship available. The most modern battleships the Navy had built were on the bottom of the harbor or under repair. So Nimitz read his orders from the deck of a submarine, the USS Grayling, a submariner inheriting a surface fleet that no longer existed, in a harbor that still smelled of burning oil and unrecovered dead. His staff officers gathered on the dock to watch. These were Kimmel's men, the intelligence officers, the war planners, the logistics staff, who had been at their desks on December 7th and had spent the 3 weeks since either helping with the recovery or preparing to be dismissed. They had not been sleeping. They had not been eating well. They knew the investigative machinery was moving, and they knew that institutional logic demanded sacrifices. Nimitz called them together the same day. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. The people who knew him well noted that he almost never raised his voice, and that this did not mean he was not listened to. He told them this: any officer who wanted a transfer would receive one. No questions asked, no record of the request held against them. If they wanted out of the Pacific Fleet's command structure, if they wanted distance from the investigation, distance from the coming fight, distance from the man who had just arrived in a civilian suit on Christmas morning, they could have it. But he hoped most of them would stay. They knew this theater. They knew the Japanese order of battle. They knew the intelligence. They knew the geography, the weather patterns, the supply lines, the existing war plans and their weaknesses. Firing them would satisfy the newspapers. It would look decisive. It would demonstrate that accountability existed and that heads had rolled. Keeping them might actually win the war. Almost every one of them stayed. Later that same day, Nimitz met alone with husband Kimmel. What passed between them in that room was not recorded. We know only what Nimitz said, and we know because Kimmel never forgot it and later described the moment in his own memoirs. Nimitz told the broken Admiral that what had happened at Pearl Harbor could have happened to anyone. Given the same intelligence, given the same intelligence failures, the same diplomatic failures, the same doctrine, the same deployment decisions made months before the attack, it could have happened to any officer in the Navy. Including, Nimitz said himself. Kimmel did not speak. It was the most generous sentence anyone had offered Kimmel in 3 weeks, and it came from the man who had just taken his job. Beneath the district headquarters at Pearl Harbor, in a windowless basement that had no natural light and no scheduled hours, a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort was not sleeping. He worked in a bathrobe and slippers. This was not eccentricity, or not only eccentricity, it was practicality. He lived in that basement. He had not seen sunlight in days. He ran Station Hypo, the Pacific Fleet's code-breaking unit, with a staff of roughly 100 cryptanalysts, linguists and mathematicians, who were doing work that no one fully understood except the people doing it. They were attacking JN-25, the Japanese Naval Operational Code, a 5-digit numeric cipher with over 33,000 code groups and a separate additive table that changed on a rotating schedule. Breaking it required not just mathematical skill, but the ability to recognize patterns in partial information, to make probabilistic arguments about meaning from fragments, and to be right often enough that an admiral would bet the fleet on your conclusions. Rochefort's team had been at this for months before Pearl Harbor. After December 7th, the stakes changed in a way that required no explanation. Nimitz met Rochefort within days of arriving at Pearl Harbor. The relationship that developed between them was unusual in any organizational structure and extraordinary in a military one. Nimitz trusted Rochefort's analysis, not because Rochefort always agreed with Washington, he frequently did not, but because Rochefort's track record of being right was visible and measurable in a way that most intelligence work is not. In the spring of 1942, after the raids on the Marshall Islands and the Doolittle strike on Tokyo had demonstrated that American carriers could operate offensively and that the Japanese perimeter was not impregnable, Rochefort's team began to see a pattern. Japanese communications kept referencing a target designated AF. The communications indicated a major offensive, more ships, more aircraft, more coordination than anything the Japanese had attempted since Pearl Harbor. Rochefort studied the traffic and concluded that AF was Midway Atoll, the small American outpost 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, and that the Japanese were preparing an operation designed to destroy whatever carrier force the United States could field in its defense. Naval intelligence in Washington disagreed. The analysts at Maine Navy believed AF was a designation for the Hawaiian Islands themselves, or possibly Alaska, or possibly the West Coast. They told Nimitz not to move his carriers. They told him Rochefort's reading was wrong. Nimitz believed Rochefort. To confirm the target identification, Rochefort devised a simple test. He had Midway's radio operators transmit an uncoded message reporting that the atoll's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese communications began to reference water supply problems at AF. The Japanese had confirmed their own target. Nimitz now knew what was coming, approximately when it was coming, and approximately how large the force would be. He was betting everything he had left on a lieutenant commander who worked in a bathrobe in a basement against the explicit advice of the Navy's intelligence establishment in Washington. He went to work. On the 27th of May, 1942, 20 days after the Battle of the Coral Sea, where American and Japanese carriers had fought each other to a strategic standoff at the cost of the Lexington and serious damage to the Yorktown, the USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor trailing an oil slick 10 miles long. A 551-pound Japanese armor-piercing bomb had punched through her flight deck during the Coral Sea engagement and detonated 50 feet below, killing dozens, gutting 3 decks, and opening seams in her hull. The fires had been controlled. The ship had made it back under her own power, but she was not a fighting ship. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch had already filed his assessment. Based on the damage to the internal structure, the state of the boilers, the condition of the hull frames, the sheer scope of what needed to be replaced and repaired. 90 days. Minimum. The Yorktown needed 90 days in dry dock. Nimitz had a different number. He had been given Rochefort's best estimate. The Japanese offensive against Midway would begin no later than the first week of June. That was 10 days, maybe 12. The Enterprise and the Hornet were available and operational, but 2 carriers against 4 Japanese fleet carriers was not a battle. It was a calculation that produced a known outcome. The Yorktown changed that calculation. 3 carriers versus 4 was a fight. 2 carriers versus 4 was not. Nimitz stood on the dock of Dry Dock No. 1, the same dry dock the Japanese had chosen not to bomb on December 7th, and told the Navy Yard inspectors his deadline. 72 hours, 1,400-yard workers descended on the carrier. 3 shifts, around the clock. The dry dock was kept flooded with workers while ordnance was being loaded simultaneously. Welders cut and replaced steel on the flight deck while aviation mechanics worked below. The damaged boilers, which would have taken weeks to remove and replace properly, were patched and left in place. The internal shell frames that structurally should have been replaced were assessed, judged adequate for operational purposes, and left. Perfect was not available. Operational was. 72 hours later, USS Yorktown put to sea. She was not the ship she had been. Her boilers were running on patchwork. Her internal structure carried damage that a proper repair would have addressed differently. But she was floating, she was moving, and her aircraft could fly. Nimitz had one more decision to make. Vice Admiral William Halsey was the natural choice to command the carrier task force at Midway. He was aggressive, experienced, known to the Japanese. He had led the Doolittle raid. He understood carrier warfare in a way that only a handful of American officers did. He was also in the hospital, a severe dermatitis, stress-induced, aggravated by months of continuous operations, had left him physically unable to command. He would not sail. Halsey recommended his replacement before he went ashore. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the cruiser escort for Task Force 16. Spruance was calm, precise, and methodical in a way that bordered on the mathematical. He had never commanded carriers. He had spent his career in surface warships. He had no experience with the tactical geometry of carrier aviation, no background in the doctrine that Nimitz's carrier admirals had been developing through hard experience since December. Nimitz gave him the carriers anyway. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard the patched-up Yorktown, would command Task Force 17. Together, 3 American carriers, 2 of them fully operational, one of them held together with 3 days of emergency welding, steamed north and east to a position that Nimitz had chosen from a basement in Pearl Harbor, based on the calculations of a man in a bathrobe, against the advice of Washington, against the visible odds. They were waiting when the Japanese arrived. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the Japanese striking force, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kakaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, was steaming toward Midway. Their commanders believed they were sailing into a trap of their own design. They believed the American carriers were still in the South Pacific, still recovering from the Coral Sea. They believed they would hit Midway, provoke a response, and destroy the American carriers when they arrived in a rush. They were wrong about almost everything. There were 3 American carriers in the ocean northeast of Midway, not 2, not 1. 3. They were already there, already waiting, already positioned at the exact coordinates that Nimitz had specified based on Rochefort's intelligence. The Japanese fleet had sailed into the trap. They just didn't know it yet. At 20 minutes past 10 on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown broke through the cloud cover above the Japanese fleet. They had been searching for hours. They had flown off course. They had burned fuel they couldn't replace. They arrived in a state of low fuel, high altitude, and complete surprise. 5 minutes later, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning. Kaga, Soryu, Akagi. 3 carriers that Japan had built over years, crewed with the best-trained naval aviators in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean and every engagement since December, burning in the span of minutes. Hiryu launched counterstrikes that hit the Yorktown twice more, severely enough that she had to be abandoned. But Hiryu's aircraft were destroyed in the process, and that afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found Hiryu and left her burning as well. By nightfall on June 4, 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. The Yorktown would sink on June 7th, finished by a Japanese submarine while under tow, but the strategic situation was irreversible by then. 4 fleet carriers. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators dead, 248 aircraft lost. And the pilots Japan had lost at Midway were pilots Japan could not replace on any schedule that mattered. The Japanese naval aviation training pipeline was too small, too slow, and too rigid to produce replacements at the rate the Pacific War now required. The men who had trained for years to fly from carrier decks, to deliver torpedoes and bombs with precision, those men were gone. The pilots Japan sent into combat 18 months later were not the pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor. The strategic initiative in the Pacific War passed to the United States on the 4th of June, 1942. It did not pass back. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, who had said 6 months earlier that Nimitz was a bureaucrat, a desk admiral, not a warfighter, watched the battle reports come in, and said nothing, publicly, about what he had said before. Nimitz would go on. The war after Midway was not simple or clean. Guadalcanal cost more than anyone in Washington had budgeted, in ships, in aircraft, in marines, in months of grinding combat in disease-ridden jungle. The Solomon Islands campaign consumed resources at a rate that alarmed planners in Washington and London alike. There were defeats. There were ships lost, including carriers. There were arguments with MacArthur about strategy and resources, and whose theatre took priority that produced some of the most heated inter-service conflict of the war. But the arc was fixed. After Midway, the question was not whether Japan could be defeated. It was how long it would take. Nimitz commanded 5,000 ships, 20,000 aircraft, and more than 2 million men and women before the war was over. He was made Fleet Admiral in December of 1944, a 5-star rank that Congress created specifically because the scale of the Pacific War had no precedent, and the existing rank structure had no room for the commanders it required. Only 4 American officers held the rank of Fleet Admiral during the Second World War. Chester Nimitz was one of them. On September 2, 1945, Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Missouri was moored in the same waters where, 40 years earlier, a young ensign aboard the USS Ohio had watched the victory celebrations for Admiral Togo's triumph at Tsushima. Japan had won that battle. Japan was surrendering this war. Nimitz signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States. He signed it quietly. He had conducted the entire war that way. Years later, an old man was asked about Pearl Harbor. He surprised the interviewer. It was a mercy, Nimitz said. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, in a specific and measurable way, a mercy. He explained it carefully, the way a man who has thought about something for decades explains it. Not to shock, but because the arithmetic is real and he wants the record to be accurate. If Kimmel had received adequate warning that the Japanese attack was coming, if the intelligence had worked the way it should have, if the diplomatic signals had been read correctly, if the radar contact that was reported at 7:02 a.m. had been taken seriously, the Pacific Fleet would not have been sitting in the harbour on the morning of December 7th. Kimmel would have sailed out to meet the Japanese force in the open ocean. What would have happened then? The American Pacific Fleet of December 1941 was built around battleships. 8 of them, slow, heavily armoured, armed with guns that could fire shells over the horizon. They were designed to fight the decisive naval battle that Mahan had theorized, 2 fleets of capital ships meeting at sea and determining the outcome of the war in an afternoon. Against a Japanese striking force built around 6 fleet carriers and over 400 aircraft, the American battleships would have had no air cover, no carrier support, and no realistic defense against dive bombers and torpedo planes operating from beyond visual range. The battle would have been decided before the American guns could engage. The battleships would have gone to the bottom in water. That is not 30 feet deep, but thousands of feet deep. The crews would have drowned, not in the hundreds but in the tens of thousands, with no possibility of rescue, in waters too deep to recover the ships. The submarine base, the repair yards, the fuel tanks, all of them would have been untouched. But none of it would have mattered, because the fleet that was supposed to operate from Pearl Harbor would have been scattered across the Pacific floor. Instead, in the shallow water of the harbor, the math was different. 6 of the 8 battleships that were damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, and returned to service. Not to carrier task forces, the battleships that fought at Surigao Strait in October of 1944 were using Pearl Harbor's radar systems to lay fire on Japanese destroyers in the dark, avenging their own sinking in one of the war's more poetic engagements. The Oklahoma was the only battleship damaged at Pearl Harbor that was not returned to service, and even she was raised. The crews were rescued from shallow water instead of drowning in deep water. The repair yards were intact and available to repair them. The fuel was there when the carriers came home. The submarine base was operational from the first week of the war. The disaster that destroyed one navy created the conditions for another. Whether any other officer on that list of 29 would have seen that on Christmas morning, 1941, standing at the edge of a burning harbour in a civilian suit, in a country that had just been attacked and wanted immediate vengeance, and had been given a submariner instead of a warrior, that is a question that has no answer. What is answerable is this: Nimitz saw it. He saw what survived. He kept the staff that knew where the intelligence was buried. He trusted the man in the bathrobe over the analysts in Washington. He gave 3 days to repair a carrier that needed 90. He gave carriers to a cruiser officer who had never commanded one. He bet the fleet on intelligence that the Navy's own establishment had told him was wrong. And he was right. Not lucky. Right. The distinction matters. There is a final detail about Chester Nimitz that does not appear in most accounts of the Pacific War, and that is perhaps the most revealing thing about the man. In 1934, Nimitz, then a captain years before Pearl Harbor, years before he had any way of knowing what was coming, marched in the funeral procession for Admiral Haihachiro Togo, the man whose hand he had shaken as a young ensign in Tokyo Bay. Japan's greatest naval hero, Nimitz was an American naval officer marching at the funeral of the man who had built the navy he would one day defeat. 20 years after that, long after the surrender had been signed, long after the war was a historical fact rather than a present reality, Nimitz became the first American to donate money toward the restoration of Togo's flagship, the Mikasa. The battleship was deteriorating in a Japanese harbor. Nimitz contributed to its preservation. A man from Fredericksburg, Texas, a submariner. The commander who had accepted the most important military command in American history when 28 other admirals found reasons not to. Keeping faith with an enemy's dead across a war he had fought and won, in waters he had once sailed as a young man who just wanted to see the ocean. That is who Frank Knox put in the chair on December 16, 1941. That is who Franklin Roosevelt did not ask. That is the man.